Great. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for showing up at this late hour to see this sort of poorly designed or poorly defined talk. You may have seen in the poster that the name of the talk was Manufacturing Authority. That name has been shifted around a little bit, and it's now called I'm Not a Real Bureaucracy, but I Play One on the Internet. And it's a talk a little bit about a design question that I've been playing around with for the last few years. And so what I'm going to talk about is that design question. And then I'm going to talk about sort of 3 projects that I've worked on in the last few years that sort of experiment and play around with this concept. And I understand from Max that this is a little bit outside of the usual sort of design process talk. But I think the question I want to tackle is actually one that is very near and dear to the heart of design. And that question is, how is design used to project authority? And connected to this, I want to talk about trends in who can do design and what those trends mean for sort of society as a whole. I'm hoping this will actually be a pretty conversational session. So if I'm saying anything or I have a tendency to talk very quickly, feel free to just raise a hand and we can pause for a question or discussion. So because I'm not a designer, I felt it might be useful to talk just briefly about some of the experiences that sort of bring me here tonight. So first, a little bit about me. So my original background is in software engineering as a coder. And a few years back, I got really interested in the idea of trying to take lawyers and replace them with machines. And so I figured the easiest way to learn how to do that was just to go to law school and figure out whether or not it was possible. And for a number of years, I ran a real, not so real law firm called Robot, and Hwang. That's 2 robot partners and myself. And the work there was basically automating legal jobs. And it was kind of thinking about the role and the connection between sort of automation and legal policy. Some of that pulled me into a project that I did for a research center in New York called Data and Society that was kind of more broadly thinking about sort of intelligent systems and AI, and specifically its impact on social equity, right? You may have heard that a lot of systems, for example, in criminal justice now are being designed to work autonomously. And these systems are defined in ways that, for example, have disparate racial effects, right? And so there's these really interesting dynamics playing out at the intersection between law and tech. And then most recently, I finished up a 2-year stint basically heading up global public policy for Google in AI and machine learning. And so public policy is really kind of the work of talking to governments that come to the company and say, how do you make sure that your AI is fair or safe? What will an autonomous vehicle do if it has to decide between hitting an old person and 2 young people, right? Those types of questions. And I've recently left that, and so my day job really is running this program called the Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative. And what it is it's a hybrid sort of philanthropic project and research initiative that's based at MIT and Harvard. And the project is specifically funding researchers, activist groups, nonprofits to kind of work on these intersections between sort of emerging technologies and their social impact. So a little bit of background, not really sort of from a design background, but largely from kind of like a tech and society background. And you'll see that's reflected a little bit about what I'll talk about. And I think more importantly, everything I've told you for the last 5 minutes you should forget, because I'm actually not going to talk about any of those experiences. I'll instead be talking about sort of a set of random side projects I've been working on that touch on some of these issues, but are really quite different, as you'll see. So as I mentioned, the lecture tonight is about the relationship between design on one hand and then sort of authority, broadly writ, on the other. And a good way sort of into this question is somewhat of what I would call kind of like a childish inquiry, right? Which is, how do we know we are in the presence of a formidable institution, right? So that is to say, when do we know we're somewhere important, like we're in an important location, or we're working with an important institution? How do we know that it's a government, for instance, or a big company? And that's an open query. I don't know if anyone from the audience wants to volunteer. Like, how do we know that? When you are talking to a government or trying to go to the DMV, why do you know it's governmental or important in some way? I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer.
Mostly hearsay.
Right.
How much value is deemed to be put into it by what?
Right. Like know that it's a government because people told you it was a government. Yeah, that's I think definitely one piece of it. Any other thoughts on how we know? Yep, over there. I saw a hand go up. Maybe not. though.
I don't know, go to the website and see if there's like .com.
Right. Like the website, the URL is important, for sure. Sure, yeah, right. So like serious organizations are like the Department of Justice, right? Or the Institute on so-and-so, right? And I think that's right. I think people are touching on a lot of themes that is exactly what I want to explore, is sort of the role of design elements in conveying that something is important or authoritative, right? So just a couple of ones that I thought of kind of preparing this presentation. So one of them is the design of physical space, right? The White House is fenced off, not just anyone can wander in. It's kind of set away from the street. It looks like an important, building. Sometimes that's just something that's really kind of expensive, right? The Hall of Mirrors, Versailles in France, right? We know it's an important place because it seems like someone really spent a lot of money trying to make it look pretty important. And that's how we know that it's an important space. So certainly physical architecture is one kind of powerful engine for conveying authority. Another one that Max is picking up on is titles, bureaucracy, right? It's an important institution when you're dealing with the deputy director, because the real director doesn't have time to talk to you, right? That's when it's a really important organization, or you have a secretary of defense or a council, right? So the use of titles, right, is another powerful way in which you say, this is an important institution, and you should listen to what this institution has to say. Another obvious one, if you think about it, is uniforms, right? What people wear, and the degree to which they are arrayed in orderly lines, right, also suggests, right, that this is an important institution. And then finally, probably near and dear to kind of people who are going through kind of training and education, right, is certifications, right? At the end of this, you get a piece of paper, and the piece of paper says you graduated from college, or I have this little booklet, this little blue booklet called a passport. And when I wave it around, it lets me go through a border, right? And what I guess I want to suggest is all the things that I've just mentioned, talked about, right? Architecture, uniforms, even the URL, the .gov URL, right? These are all credibly part of the design process, right? These are things that are kind of consciously engineered, consciously constructed. And so I think the next bit of inquiry is to ask the maybe philosophical question of, so why do big institutions implement design in this way, right? Like, what purpose does it serve? Why do they invest in it? And this is another childish question, but I think it's worth kind of pulling out some of the intuitions here. So there's many good reasons for this, right? So one of them is you sort of need design to function. So there's a great book by a guy by the name of James Scott, who wrote a book called Seeing Like a State. And his argument is basically that governments need what he calls legibility in order to administrate things. So the way to think about this is, if I need to tax people, I need to know where those people live, right? And so I need processes that are put into place for me to do that efficiently. So he tells these really amazing stories, for example, about how the invention of last names is in part tied to the invention of the tax system, right? That in order to tax, you need to know who's in a family. In order to have a family, you need to impose last names. So there's really interesting situations where sort of colonial authorities will sort of come into a country or a culture that doesn't have last names and then impose those last names as a way to administrate. And so that's in part a design element. You need it internally just to function. So what he means by legibility is, in order for the state to see, it has to impose a pattern on the universe, has to impose a pattern on the world in order to just do what it wants to do at large scale. Right? So you can imagine saying, if we don't have computers, we don't have a filing system, how do we run the US government, right? Or how do we run a company that's like Goldman Sachs, like a bank? The question is you can't, right? And so you need kind of process design to make that even possible. You also need design in this sense, right? Which is that you need design to let everybody know that you are authoritative, right? So an institution really isn't powerful if no one knows that you have that authority to actually wield. And so there's another element to which institutions invest in design, in part because it's important for people to know about the authority that you do have, right? And that itself is a powerful thing to sort of invest in. So it's worth it to invest in this kind of design. And there's a really interesting story from evolutionary biology. And the question is, why do peacocks have large plumage, right? This is like, for such a small bird, it's like a very important, expensive thing for a species or an animal to invest in. And one answer is it's so people know, right? Like plumage helps peacocks mate. It's a good signal that they are a good mate, and that's why they grow plumage. But the metaphor is also good in another way, right? Which is that peacocks invest in this in order to show that they are healthy, right? Like an animal that can't grow good plumage is one that doesn't have a whole lot of energy to spend on growing plumage, right? And so the fact that you have plumage is a signal to other members of the peacock species that you are a healthy mate. And I think this is maybe one way of thinking about the way design and authority are related. Because in the past, it was extremely expensive to wield design in this way, right? To basically say, OK, what we need is a group of designers to come up with a really awesome uniform. Then we need all those uniforms to be manufactured and distributed to everybody. And then now we need everybody to wear them consistently, right? You needed huge amounts of resources in order to get design deployed at scale. And so design conveys authority, and these symbols of design, things like Inspector General or like the Department of Science, right, are authoritative to us, and they have the ring of authority in part because institutions really invested in kind of building up the sort of power of those names and those titles. And so we've really tended to associate certain kinds of design as the province of entities that we might call sort of established or important or authoritative or formidable, any of the words that kind of I've been using for the last few minutes. So that was then. And I think one intriguing sort of dimension of this that I really want to talk about is how that's changing, right? That in the past, you needed lots of resources to deploy design, and you needed those resources in order to show that you were an important institution. But we also live in an era where the tools to do design are increasingly democratized, right? You imagine in a pre-Photoshop world, in a pre-CAD world, trying to design things, it's just a lot more expensive. You need a lot more resources. And so the institutions that can afford to use design in this way are the most important ones, are the ones that are the most well-resourced. But now with a little bit of money, maybe you even rip it from online, so it's free, right? Suddenly you have access to all these tools to do the work of design. And I'm really intrigued by that notion because suddenly, think about the dynamic that we just talked about and the relationship between sort of design on one hand and authority on the other. Suddenly anyone can replicate the symbols that used to signify importance, right? And I think that's a really intriguing outcome for a couple of reasons that I really want to kind of maybe dig into for the next few minutes. The first one is it's suddenly possible for everybody to do like pretty good design, right? That effectively anyone can look like a big institution when they really are effectively just a couple of kids hiding in a trench coat, right? And that like this is actually a really interesting mechanism that like now big institutions appear visually or even maybe feature design in ways that are much similar to organizations that have much lower amounts of resources. And so there's ability to kind of fake authority in a way that is much more difficult and hasn't been possible in the past. And so there's maybe two ways of thinking about this. The first way is kind of the sort of democratizing message, right? It's great. Now everybody can look authoritative, right? You may be kind of already anticipating the punchline when you can also think about the downsides of all this, right? So we can think about, for example, the fact that HuffingtonPolitics.com, right, is a credible website online is because it's able to borrow sort of the sort of veneer of an established kind of news site, even though it is not the Huffington Post, is its own website, right, and is spreading articles actually that are not actually true, right? And so there's this really interesting dynamic where sort of the democratization of these tools also allows people to design and deploy design for authority in both sort of good and arguably sort of socially negative kind of ways. So I've been talking very sort of abstractly for the last few minutes. So maybe let me just put it into like a quick diagram, which will kind of guide us through sort of like the rest of the sort of lecture. So in the past, we might think that, basically organizational resources and sort of authority through design were positively correlated, right? So that the more resources you had, the more interest you had in projecting your authority to the world, you would have better designed things, right? You would have more officially designed things that would look very important and might be like Versailles, right? Like it's really difficult to replicate Versailles even today just because I don't have access to gold and jewel and mirrors to build a hall like that. And so one way of kind of thinking about what the sort of internet has done, what these kind of publishing technologies has done is basically allow organizations with much smaller amounts of resources, practically informal, practically not even organizations at all, to acquire the sort of design authority, to use design to project authority in ways that actually don't reflect their underlying, strength, reflect their underlying resources, their ability to kind of reach out and be like, I am like the government, or I am like a big company. And I think there's a good caveat here, a good counter argument here to maybe just pause on really quickly, which is that I don't want to necessarily make this sound like a new process. So I think a little bit sometimes about the historical moment when the first billboard was put up. And someone drove by that first billboard and they're like, that guy on that billboard says I should smoke cigarettes. He seems really credible. I should go and do that, right? That was actually a moment in history where billboards were incredibly effective. And in part because those signals conveyed a certain persuasiveness that they don't have today, right? You can drive past hundreds of billboards, right, on the way from downtown LA to Long Beach and not pay attention to a single billboard, right? And so I think what we're seeing is kind of successive generations of these kind of persuasive methods come and go, right? And so that kind of the old methodology of like you get a guy to literally dress up like a doctor and be like, cigarettes are great, is actually no longer a technique that works. Like this is laughable now in part because some of these tools got democratized, they became ubiquitous, we sort of forgot them, right? And so really I'm kind of talking about something more specific, which is sort of that these tools are allowing us to replicate certain types of symbols of authority. And so we can start to investigate this. We can think about this as a design problem, and we can start to think about this as like something we can actually go in and start playing around with. Can we start messing with this dynamic that I can basically print counterfeit authority just like as a guy who's sitting in my basement? And so I'm going to talk about 3 projects tonight that I've worked on that I think elucidate sort of different aspects of this dynamic that I'm playing around with. The first one on the left is a project called the Awesome Foundation for the Arts and Sciences. It's a philanthropic initiative. The middle one is something called the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory, which is a fan club for infrastructure that we'll talk about in just a second. And then the final one is an academic journal called the California Review of Images and Mark Zuckerberg. It's an academic journal about Mark Zuckerberg. So let me dive into this and talk about each one of these projects and I guess how they play with this idea. So first, the Infrastructure Observatory. One of my longtime obsessions has been infrastructure, right? So this world of basically people who spend all the time figuring out, how to make the electricity work, right? And it turns out that for every kind of little thing, there's just huge teams of people working to make it happen. But largely, these kinds of spaces, right? So shipping containers is a great example of this. They're kind of closed off from the outside world, there was a sort of interesting question on like, how do you get your way into one of these places, right? If you want to see them, you want to experience them, you want to talk to people around them. And so a few years ago, I had a conversation with a friend where he was like, oh yeah, in high school we did all sorts of field trips, and there was this one great field trip where we went to a nuclear power plant. And I was like, what high school did you go to let you go into this nuclear power plant? And I was like, I kind of want to do that today as like a grown-up adult. And so I called Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant, which is down in SLO, and called them up on the phone. And I said, oh, do you guys do tours? And they're like, oh yeah, occasionally we do tours. And we got down this conversation. And then eventually at some point they were like, wait, so who are you again? And I was like, oh, well, I just live in the neighborhood. I just we want to stop by if that's okay. And their reaction was basically like, no, that's insane. Like, why are you even calling us? And so sort of was left with a problem, right? Like, how do we get into this institution, right? Well, maybe one way is to basically pretend we are as important as they are, potentially. Yes, sir?
The Long Beach port, by the way, gives tours. There's boat tours.
Yeah, and I think increasingly there's places that are doing this, which is like super exciting. So me and a couple friends, we got together, we put together like a really official looking website with a logo, like Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory, and then we basically just waited for 3 or 4 months. And then we called them back again. It was like, I think like 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. And we actually went through exactly the same conversation because they had forgotten me about that point. So I was like, oh, do you guys do tours? So on and so forth. And then at some point they were like, so who are you again? And I was like, well, my name is Tim Hwang and I'm a regional director of the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory. And we're an interest group of professionals that tour infrastructure. And their reactor was like a long pause on the phone. And I was like, I'm just going to get sent to prison or something. And then they were like, well, that's great. When can you come by? And are there any parts of the power plant you'd like to see? And I was like, well, this is amazing. We should definitely do this. And so we took a tour of the power plant. They took us to the control room. We went to the turbines. And it was suddenly this moment where it was like, OK, well, wow, with the sort of command of design we were able to sort of put forth, we were able to kind of get access to this space. And the great thing is, now that we had gone to one place, we could go to other places and say, well, those other guys let us in. You should definitely go with us, because we're definitely a real thing. So if you've been in the Bay Area recently, they were building the Bay Bridge at the time. And so we had the same conversation. We called them and it said, well, we've taken many tours, the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And they were like, OK, well, yeah, we'll give you a tour there. And so we started going on more and more and more tours. And this basically became a project that we were doing for a number of different years and led to some really kind of interesting moments. We got to tour this kind of subway line that was still being constructed and got to see a lot of different things. And I think one of the most interesting parts of it was that we started to hear from people in other cities basically saying, hey, could we pretend to be members of the Infrastructure Observatory? Because it'd make it a lot easier for us to get into these power plants if we could point to you. And so essentially over a course of a few years, we sort of became a national network that was basically credibility laundering with one another. Everybody would just say, oh, we got to talk with national, and it was just like someone else. And ended up becoming a network that allowed us to access all of these interesting different places. And I think that this is really a demonstration of the dynamic that sort of we were just talking about in the very beginning, which is that an entity with zero resources could basically fake its way into a large institution by sort of operating as a peer with that institution, right? Why would you turn us away? After all, we're the Bay Area Infrastructure Observatory. So this is kind of maybe not that big of a surprise, right? People do this kind of fakery all the time. And in some ways, this is just kind of an execution of sort of using symbols to get access to things, right? How do you pretend to be an institution so you can climb in through the window, you can see things that you might have not been able to see before? And so start to think about OK, well, all right, maybe that's one magic trick you can pull off, right? Which is hey, if you fake these things, it turns out there's a lot of ways of getting access. Well, could we use that as a way of actually moving capital around? Could we persuade people to give money to things and become sort of institutions in their community? And so that brings me to the second project I'd like to talk about, which is the Awesome Foundation for the Arts and Sciences. And the root and origin of the Awesome Foundation for the Arts and Sciences is basically that philanthropy is dominated by a number of extremely large philanthropies. So I don't know if you've had the chance to try to apply for nonprofit funding, but it's basically a total nightmare, right? And I had a bunch of friends who were getting really excited about projects and being like, all right, we're going to get this thing funded. And then they'd come back basically months later completely deflated because the funder was basically forcing them into this process that kind of ground out sort of all the joy from the thing that they wanted to do. And that's for a number of reasons, right? I mean, these institutions, philanthropies, they're very large. There's a lot of overhead. They spend a lot of money just getting the money out the door. And so there's these interesting dynamics where you can actually ask for too little money for these foundations, where it's actually not worth it for them to give the money because of the amount of effort they put into just getting money out the door. And so thinking about this problem, me and a couple friends decided that what we would do is just announce that we were starting our own foundation. And the foundation would be called the Awesome Foundation for the Arts and Sciences. And it was a really simple project. Basically, we would get 10 people together. Each of them would contribute $100 a month. And that would form one $1,000 grant. And that grant would then just be given to someone that we deemed worthy, right? That we would consider to be forwarding the interests of awesome in the universe. That was our tagline, essentially. And so this is a project that we launched up in Boston. And we set up the form. And what was amazing was we start to get people to apply, right? It actually turns out that once you pretend to be a foundation, people treat you like a foundation. And so we ended up funding a number of sort of interesting projects really at this intersection, right? Where $1,000 actually really makes a difference between something happening and not happening. So to just give you an example of some of the things that we did. So we funded a giant hammock. This is the first project that we funded. Basically, an artist was like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if we could build a hammock for a public park that 25 people could hang out in? And so we basically funded her for the fabrication of that. And what was really interesting is that the projects themselves ended up promoting the Awesome Foundation itself. So there was kind of this virtuous cycle that would get started. Another fun project, we were around in Boston at the time, and there was a kid who got in touch with us. He was one of these kids who went to MIT who was like this savant. He basically had, and it was a savant specifically for cotton candy. So ever since he was in high school, he was working on the creation of cotton candy machines. He held several patents on cotton candy, and he pitched us on like, I've worked out this cotton candy extrusion technique that will allow you to create a cotton candy cannon that will project cotton candy up to 20 feet. And we were like, this is a great project. We're definitely going to fund this. And so the Awesome Foundation did. We funded his prototype on a cotton candy cannon. It was great. At the awards party, his parents actually turned up. And they were like, man, when we thought he went to college, he'd be like done with his cotton candy stuff. And like you guys just came in and gave him like another amount of money to go work on this project. And so we ended up working on a lot of projects of this kind. And a little bit like the Infrastructure Observatory, there's this sort of interesting dynamic where people would start to get in touch with us and say, could we start our own Awesome Foundation? Because it turns out that now you have this brand that people apply to. It's really easy to get new foundations started and off the ground. And so we ended up kind of spreading all over the place. Canada in particular was quite interesting. They had to figure out ways of translating the word awesome into French. And so their solution was La Fondation Formidable, which I thought was like quite good. And we ultimately became this kind of global network of chapters funding awesome things. And so this was started back in 2011, and now, about 6 or 7 years on, we've sort of given away about $3.5 million in $1,000 grants, about 89 chapters in 16 different countries. And ironically, actually, after all my complaining and carping about foundations, we actually have our own real foundation now, which is called the Institute on Higher Awesome Studies, which funds cutting-edge awesomeness research or something. I don't know. So this has kind of been an ongoing project and a really interesting one. So here's another dynamic. We can take a step back now and say, OK, what's the relationship here between sort of design and authority? And this opens up another sort of interesting route in my mind, which is the last magic trick I did was a really simple one, right? Which is use authority to get into places that you wouldn't otherwise get into. This is another game, right? Which is basically like once you have the kind of shell of a much larger institution, it turns out resources start flowing to that, right? That you can actually become a larger institution through this kind of counterfeit credibility that you're creating. That might sound a little bit like a Ponzi scheme, but I think the really interesting thing here is that it works, right? That you can actually play with these aspects of design in order to kind of get into another sort of reality, as it were, right? You can really kind of get the organizational resources that you need. So the final project that I'll talk a little bit about, and then I think we can probably just kind of go to the discussion. So the California Review of Images and Mark Zuckerberg is a project that I just launched this year. And it goes to the question, well, not really the question, but basically it was a number of drinks with a friend at a bar. Because I'm a huge nerd, I kind of sheepishly admitted like I had been collecting weird photos of Mark Zuckerberg on my phone, just browsing the news, right? And he was like, oh, I also am collecting weird photos of Mark Zuckerberg on my phone. And so we had a very strange evening just comparing like, oh, that's a really rare Zuck you got there. Like, that's a really good one. And it was a very long evening. I don't remember much of it. The great thing about Mark Zuckerberg, right, is that he is symbolic in so many ways. He is a particular leading light in startups from a certain generation. But he's also been recorded in a number of extremely strange visual images as well. So this is one of my favorites. This is Mark Zuckerberg showing off the Oculus Rift. There's a lot going on here. I don't know, the more you look at it, the more it comes out, the stranger it seems. He seems kind of distant in his smile here. What's everybody looking at? And so this got me really excited. I was like, wow, there's actually a lot to think about with this kind of stuff. I was also a fan of this one during his hearing. Also quite interesting. A lot of people were like, wow, what does this say about Facebook? Is Zuckerberg us? Are we Zuckerberg? Or yeah, it's really, really interesting stuff. And so the idea here was, could we encourage more public inquiry about the public face of Mark Zuckerberg? And the easiest way to do that was a couple things. You could say, okay, well, maybe just, Joe Schmo, Joe Bag of Donuts, will just write an op-ed being like, it's really weird that Mark Zuckerberg is portrayed in this way. But another alternative is, again, to use sort of design and sort of language as a way of kind of faking a kind of authority to encourage certain types of action. And so what we did is we basically created an academic journal. So the California Review of Images of Mark Zuckerberg is an academic examination of the visual culture of Mark Zuckerberg. And you can see it at zuckerbergreview.com if you want to read the articles. And what was really interesting about this project is sort of came at a time when people were really trying to figure out, like, make sense of, like, what is Facebook and, like, what is the 2016 election. And we got tons of really interesting articles. So we have a great feature about Mark Zuckerberg sweating, all sorts of examples of him sweating. What does his sweating mean? There's this one, which I really enjoyed, which is a hug between him and the Indian Prime Minister, which is just extremely awkward, but actually goes to these really interesting questions. The more you dig into it is like, yeah, what is Facebook's role in expanding internationally, right? Is it a kind of colonialism? What kind of colonialism does it look like? And like, what is the relationship between these two figures? And like, why is their hug so awkward, right? Like these images reveal so much about the situation that we're in. So the latest volume just came out recently. One interesting article was this became kind of a meme in China. So this is basically Mark Zuckerberg jogging through Tiananmen Square. Interesting because the air quality is terrible. You can see that it's terrible. It's like air that no one sensible would ever want to be running in. Also intriguing because he posted it on Facebook, which is blocked in blocked in China, and people were immediately like, "How did you get a chance to like post this?" And so these stories got more and more interesting, and part of the investigation, and actually it encouraged some creation of sort of memes online around this. This is my personal favorite. Which is like incredible, just chef kisses in terms of like, it's like pure internet. And the weird thing about this is that these articles, because they were academic, again, the borrowing of another kind of authority, we sort of ended up in a bunch of places that we didn't expect, right? So because we published this journal, a lot of credible journals got in touch and said, we'd like to republish the articles from your journal. And so we actually ended up featured in Harper's, one of the articles, which is about kind of an early profile picture of Mark Zuckerberg. So this is another maybe interesting, fun game we can play with, right? Which is that we've been talking about like, how do you get your institution to be as big as the big institutions? Or how do you get resources to become as big as those big institutions, right? Those were sort of Infrastructure Observatory and Awesome Foundation, respectively. But this is another thing, which is that you can actually, because these symbols are so available, you can use them to pull symbols down, right? That institutions that otherwise would be considered a lot more important than they otherwise would be suddenly become victim because anyone can publish, right? Anyone can kind of play with these symbols. Anyone can appropriate them, right? And I ended up getting a very angry email from Facebook PR, and that's what you'd expect. But I think this is sort of another interesting sort of game. It's their attempt to kind of put the genie back in the bottle, even though the kind of technological environment is constantly changing. So just to quickly sum up, right, what have we talked about? We've talked about symbols as a means of gaining access, symbols as a means of generating resources, and symbols as a means of diluting sort of authority. And I think these are really interesting ways of kind of thinking about this relationship, not just how we design or what we design, but really what the purpose of the design is. And insofar as design and authority have kind of evolved together in so many ways, technology, I think, is really kind of getting these two things to increasingly decouple in ways that allow you to run these kind of intriguing sort of experiments right at the edge. And I think there's a lot to talk about here, right? Who you design on behalf of, right, is a really critical question. And whether or not it's for the purposes of projecting authority or projecting prestige or projecting the future even. I think the dynamics of who can design become an increasingly sort of important one. And so with that, Max and I kind of talked about different questions and things that'd be fun to dig into. Here's my obligatory contact information. And thank you very much for your time this evening. So questions either about these projects or more generally about the theory. I mean, everybody in this room is actually doing design, so you might just be like, what is this guy actually talking about? So, yes, sir.
And see where it goes.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing too is like it's actually sometimes beneficial for these things not to have heads. So one thing I've thought a lot about is like some of the most powerful institutions have no discernible head, right? That's what makes them seem extremely powerful, right? You're like, who runs the IRS? I have no idea, but like they could totally automate, right? And so like the front of a faceless organization is a design pattern that I think can be copied, right? And I think this is part of the game of like, never call yourself the executive, you're always the deputy because the real guy or gal doesn't have time to talk to you, right? Like those types of things are, I think, interesting dynamics to play with. But I think the core of your question is how much do you design sort of in advance? And I guess one of the things I've thought a lot about is like the degree to which you can replicate a pattern, right? So I'll be honest with sort of the design. So Awesome Foundation ended up being very successful and very replicable. The reason being is because it's really easy to get started, right? You just have to get 10 friends together. They all have to commit to doing $100. And then they form an Awesome Foundation. You have an Awesome Foundation. You are the leader of one automatically. And that made it really easy for people to get in touch and say, can we start one? And then what we would do is say, hey, yeah, if you can get 10 people together, that's a good filter that you're not absolutely crazy, just maybe crazy enough. And like we will grant you this authority. Infrastructure Observatory actually petered out over time. And one theory there is basically that it's a lot lumpier in terms of what you're trying to ask people to do, right? In the sense that you need to basically cold call an infrastructure and then pretend to be a thing that you're not, and then go through the entire tour with that face, right? And so it's a lot harder. Each one is a little bit different. And so as a result, the chapters didn't end up being as healthy, right? A lot of them failed very quickly. I think the Bay Area one is quite slow right now. And so one thing I think increasingly about in terms of design process is how do you set up a set of rules that make it really easy for other people to play, right? Because that allows you to bring more people into the game. So that's maybe one pattern, right? Is thinking about like, how do you set up the rules, right? Another one is kind of this game between like always switching between like purported authority and real authority, purported authority and real authority, right? Because, so in computer security, they call this permission escalation, right? Where basically like the first thing you do is you call, the mail guy, and you're like, oh, I'm this executive, I'm in a real big hurry, I need this password, and tell me where he is today, right? And then once you have that information, you can go to someone else and be like, oh, well, I know this information, so give me that, right? And I think you can do that on an organizational level, and you can do that on a design level, right? Which is you can fake it until you make it, but really more accurately what happens is you fake it, and then you make it a little bit more, and you fake it more, and you make it a little bit more. And I think about that exercise a lot, which is when to tack back and say, like, we're actually going to invest in the real authority now. And I think that's sort of an interesting kind of game that has played out. So, for example, in the Awesome Foundation case, right, like we've actually created a real nonprofit now. And that's in part because like, no matter how much you front, right, there's still some substantive things that you need to get into place. But I kind of like the idea that like the idea can sort of lean in first, and then you can kind of tack back as you go. So maybe two ways at that question. So, other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, the big hammock, did that go to Burning Man in 2014?
It's possible. It seems like a distinctly Burning Man.
Stuff would fall out of their pockets if I have it.
Well, I'm glad that was the fate of that project ultimately.
I thought it was great.
Others, thoughts, questions? I know it's a little bit outside of the usual design process. Max, yes? Yeah, definitely. So actually a fun thing to reveal is a little bit of, for I guess a design audience, like how each of these things were designed. So Awesome Foundation was designed by putting together shapes in Keynote and screenshotting it, right? Like it's like the worst kind of design. Infrastructure Observatory in particular was with sort of a real designer who does like logos for companies and stuff. And so I think that the seal was very important. Like that really seemed to make a difference on people when we would send letterhead that had the seal at top. People would be like, wow, this is a real thing, right? And so I think a seal is very important. We also we didn't do uniforms because it'd be a little bit creepy, but we basically did, we did do pins, right? And pins I think are again another really interesting thing. Like it's a bit of merch that is actually quite cheap to produce, but feels really important when you have it in your hand. And so we did membership pins so that when we go into a place, people would be like, oh wow, these are all members. They're all wearing the pin. So I think like those physical objects ended up being quite important as well. And then the final one was, so part of the logistical challenge of getting the Infrastructure Observatory to work is sometimes you have to cold call a lot of places before you find the place that will let you in. And so what I said is everybody can be executive director. And so every member within the group was all deputized to basically call a place and say, hey, I'm executive director of the Infrastructure Observatory. And that ended up being a really powerful mechanism as well. So nothing that you'd not expect, but that's kind of how we did it. We ended up ultimately doing a book called The Container Guide, which is, you have those field guides for birds. This is like a field guide to shipping containers. And like that also, like that you had a published book that you could go to on Amazon was also like an important symbol as well. So just kind of, a wave of different things. We didn't really sort of A/B test, as it were, to try to figure out which one was really the one that got us in. But maybe just some thinking about the kinds of things that we used. So, yes?
Did any one of these places like backfire when you went?
No, not really. We sort of won them over with kindness in the end. So like we got into a lot of these places. Some places were really suspicious. And like this is very niche, but like in the infrastructure space, there's a lot of paranoia, both because of security reasons, but because largely when infrastructure hears from the public, it's like because they're being yelled at, right? Like no one thinks about the trains until the trains are not working. No one thinks about the roads until the roads are blocked, right? And so like most infrastructure, the staff that really works on infrastructure tends to have like shields up. And so, part of the game ended up being, could we get in and then just like show that we were actually genuinely super interested in this? And it turns out that you don't often meet like a crowd of 50 people that really wants to talk about like asphalt leveling. And so like that ended up being like the way we did it. Now, of course, some of this comes with risk, right? I don't want to like, I think ultimately in the beginning you are, my girlfriend is like, basically you're telling people that you should just like lie for fun and profit. And like part of this is, right? Like that you are like showing yourself to be something that you're not initially. And that can easily backfire. I don't think there's any way of kind of sugarcoating that. But I think more often than not, I think it works out surprisingly well. Right, yeah. And I think, one way of thinking about it too is that like, so society functions because you have these indicators, right? Like you're like, oh, I know what this is because it comes with this package, this thing on the label. Sometimes you have traits though that like are just as good as that label, but you don't actually have the label, right? And so I guess the message of this in some ways is that like you can actually like, you can just fake those, right? Like those are cheap to acquire. So, well, I'm actually kind of curious about how far this can go, right? Like, so I'm really fascinated by, for example, the notion of like microstates, which is like you can just invent a government and make up rules, right? And like, so I think this can go very far. You can think about like for each institution in society, can you just invent one from scratch now, right? Because if sort of this argument is true, then the real, where the rubber meets the road is your ability to do that, right? So like, how easy is it to just like spin up a religion, right? How easy is it to spin up like a university, right? And so I think like there is a very far limit here, right? I guess I worry about creating things like a state just because like other states, might have something to say about that. But I think that there's actually a lot of room for experimentation on exactly this kind of game, right? Cool, well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.